let's start with the big picture. And let's actually look at the world. So, this is a median person in the world, someone who earns $10 a day. These figures are from 2005. I need to update them. These animations are so good, I've been too lazy. So there's over 6 billion people in the world, and the total income distribution in the world looks a little bit like this. This is these are 2000 figures. So, they haven't changed much in terms of the overall distribution. All right, so we've got this sort of mountain. It's always hard doing this on a computer that is not your own. There we go. And so we've got some people who end up with incomes over $100 a day, and a whack of people who end up with incomes less than $1 a day. So this is not news to you. The richest 20% of people in the world have about 75% of the income. This perhaps is not that surprising. It's a Pareto optimization rule. You probably know about that, the 80-20 rule, right? So it tends to follow in incomes. The richest 20% of people have about 80% of the income. The poorest 80% have 20. And of course that's just math, right? The richest people, you're going to have more of the income. But this gets more troubling when we look at the bottom part of the curve. The poorest 20% have only 2%. And back in 2000, about 1 in 5 people in the world lived on less than $1 a day, which is what the United Nations uses as their definition of absolute poverty. So 1 in 5 people in the world lived in absolute poverty. There we go. Now, if we roll the clock back to 1970, that's before even an old guy like me was born, we would know that almost 40% of people lived in poverty. And the world was poorer as a whole, and there were fewer people. And what happened over time is that some people in the world managed to grow out of poverty. So by 1990, we got down to about a quarter of people, but the total number of poor was the same. And in 1990, the United Nations imposed this very, very optimistic, I shouldn't use the word optimistic, optimistic set of goals called the Millennium Development Goals. And one of the MDGs, or Millennium Development Goals, was to cut the proportion of people who lived in poverty in half by 2015. So the good news is that if current trends hold, we got to about 20% in 2000, and if current trends hold, we will actually meet that goal 5 years from now, of having half the people living in absolute poverty versus 1990. Now, there's lots of problems with the simulation, but we think we can get there. However, there are some challenges. Oh my gosh, this computer has a mind of its own. Don't look at any of these things. Ruin everything. Okay, there we go. All right. There we are. What we need to do is look at the picture regionally in the world, because this is where it gets considerably more interesting. So that's Africa. Next we have the high-income countries of the OECD, including Canada, where essentially no one lives on less than $1 a day. And then we'll layer on some others in here. Latin America has amongst the richest people in the world and the poorest people in the world. I think Carlos Slim in Mexico is usually fighting with Bill Gates about whether he's the wealthiest man in the world or not. We also have some of the poorest people in the world living in the same region. Very stretched out. Eastern Europe. Now this is where it gets interesting. East Asia, mostly China. And South Asia, mostly India. Hold on to that thought. This is where this becomes quite interesting. So, if we go back to 1970, we can see that big mountain of people who were living less than $1 a day. And over time, if you watch the yellow and the blue, as well as the purple at the very bottom, you see something very interesting happening. Okay? So what's happening is that those two very large countries, China and India, are seeing great economic growth. They're taking hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. However, Africa is falling back, okay? And Latin America continues to have extremely wide disparity. So what does that actually mean? Let's zoom in on those people who are making less than $1 a day. Okay? So in 1970, most of the poorest people in the world lived in South Asia, mostly India, and East Asia, mostly China. So moms in Canada would say to their kids, finish your supper, there's starving kids in China. Today, they're more likely to say, finish your supper, there's starving kids in Sierra Leone. And you can see why. So as those two countries, China and India, grew, they managed to take a large proportion of their population out of poverty. Now, they use various techniques to do this, but what gets very interesting about this is that Africa is now the home of 1/3 of all the poor. And in fact, as present trends continue, we will soon see that the vast majority of people living in absolute poverty in the country, in the world live in Africa. So we'll make the goal, hopefully, of cutting absolute poverty in half by 2015. But Africa will not meet that goal. And this is a very interesting problem. So I've talked, oh man. I've talked quite a lot about, come on. This is no fun if you actually see the answers before I talk about them. There we go. Ignore all of this, thank you. Okay, there we go. One more. Now, there we go. So we've talked a lot about income, but income is not the only determinant of health, happiness, and quality of life. So, just for argument's sake, we will replace the dollars per day with a little more economic term, GDP per capita, okay? And we'll look at these regions in and of themselves. So that's South Asia, mostly India, East Asia, mostly China, Eastern Europe, Latin America, the high-income countries of the OECD, including Canada, and Africa. And we'll do one more little thing. We'll take the Arab states out of Africa, and we'll look at sub-Saharan Africa on its own. Okay. So, pretty big gap. GDP per capita in the poorest region is $1,750. In the richest region is $28,000. So pretty strong disparity. But let's add another factor to it. So, oh, by the way, the size of the bubbles is the size of the population that lives there. But let's add an element of health. Okay? So we use child mortality as a proxy. This is the percentage of children who die before their 5th birthday. Okay? It's a good proxy for the health situation of the entire country. So what we see, and then the animation very helpfully says, down is bad, up is good. More kids dying, bad. Fewer kids dying, good. And so what we see is that about 1 in 5 kids in sub-Saharan Africa die before their 5th birthday. And over in the high-income countries of the OECD, 0.6, 6 out of 1,000 kids die. So there's a huge difference. We live in a world that has probably a 100-fold difference in wealth and a 100-fold difference in health. If we go back to 1975, everybody was less healthy. You know, there's been lots of improvements in medicine, particularly postnatal medicine in that time. But what I really am interested in is how different regions have changed. Okay? In 1975, East Asia, mostly China, was poorer than Africa, but Africa was less healthy. And as we see over time, watch that sub-Saharan African bubble. Everyone else is getting healthier and wealthier. Okay? And Africa has actually gotten a bit poorer and about the same level of health. And in a second, you'll see how Canada went in that same time period. Okay? It gets even more shocking if we look at individual countries, and I'm just going to whip through these. So we'll break up sub-Saharan Africa into countries. Mauritius, pretty developed nation. Sierra Leone, you know, the poorest and least healthy city country in the world. Similarly, South Asia, difference between Afghanistan and Sri Lanka. The Arab states, huge difference between Yemen on the one hand and the UAE on the other, which may as well be an OECD country. East Asia, right, Singapore versus Cambodia. Central and Eastern Europe, the difference between Tajikistan and Slovenia is again remarkable. And finally, Latin America, between Haiti and Chile. So, the OECD countries, very little change. Right? They're all kind of clustered around. So there's really not much difference between Sweden and the United States. Now what's really interesting about this, and the reason that I raise it, I'm getting runny. There we go. Okay, we can do it, we can do it. No, we can't. That's interesting. Okay. The reason that I'm telling you all of this is because I think it's extremely important that when you start thinking about doing development work, that you understand that it's not very simple. That it's not really about those people who are poor and need to help them. It is about that. But it's also about how we think about the very complex situations that have led to these problems and what kind of interventions we can actually undertake. So again, we live in a world with a 100-fold difference in child mortality and a 100-fold difference in income. But let's look at some individual countries to see some interesting stats here. So Niger. In Niger, it's a pretty poor country. The average income is about $800, and 1 in 4 kids die before their 5th birthday. Eritrea, on the other hand, is just as poor, but has 1/3 the child mortality. Similarly, India is 3 times more wealthy than Eritrea, but has the same child mortality. Vietnam, the same income as India, but only 1/3 of the child mortality. South Africa, this is an interesting one. South Africa is a pretty rich country as far as countries in the world go. You know, I think a lot of people were surprised during the World Cup to see that, right? But they're 3 times wealthier than Vietnam, but have almost 3 times the child mortality. So let's pause there for a second. Why do you think that is? What's going on in South Africa that the health outcomes are so poor?
Disparity between the rich and poor.
So that's part of it. We understand that there is disparity between the rich and poor.
Maybe not.
Right, there's a few super rich people. So there's an issue of disparity and how disparity plays into health. What else? Anyone? Yes?
HIV/AIDS.
Yeah, that's really what's going on. Okay, so there's 2 issues. There's disparity and there's the prevalence of HIV/AIDS. Even in a world where we know how to prevent maternal fetal transmission of the HIV virus, we still have areas where child mortality is so very high, specifically because of that one terrible disease. And again, we can see that here, right? Malaysia, a Muslim country, different norms, different mores, very low levels of HIV infection. Okay, the same wealth as South Africa, but 1/10 of the child mortality. And we can continue to play this game. The US is 4 times wealthier than Malaysia, but the same child mortality. Imagine what the discussion about healthcare reform in the United States would have looked like if people used that statistic. But don't feel too superior here, because GDP per capita in Singapore and Sweden is lower than the United States, but they have half the child mortality. However, where is it? There we go, there's Canada. We can get all superior about the fact that the US doesn't have comprehensive universal health care. Well, we do in Canada, and we are almost at the same level of child mortality than the United States is. So there's something else going on here. It's not just the healthcare system. Maybe it's disparity, maybe it's something else.